Curtis Manning. In addition to being an associate professor of history here at the college and the producer of the series, I will also be giving the lecture tonight. So it should be a good one, I hope. Before we get into that, just a quick update on the mascot. As most of you know, the mascot of the History Lecture Series for much of its time has been Chloe Manning, my daughter, who's in 3rd grade now. But the latest thing is on her little competitive soccer team, the U9 competitive soccer team, she scored 2 goals a couple of Saturdays ago, which were her first goals. And so she's going along very, very excited. Other than that, there's not too much news, so let's go get right into the lecture so maybe we can get you back early out of this weather. So when I'm here to speak to you today, the topic of tonight's lecture is the history of higher education in Louisiana. And generally, most people, including me, went into that thinking it could be dry of some kind, something like that. But it actually turned out to be very fascinating. When I first came to New Orleans in about 2000, I came to teach at a community college here at Nunez Community College, and I'd had no experience with higher education except for being a student in it. I had never taken an education class. I'd never worked in a college, anything like that. And so when I first started and came here, I'd also had almost no experience with Louisiana, because it might surprise a lot of y'all to know that I'm not from Louisiana originally. I know a lot of people can't tell that about me by my accent or anything. And in fact, about my only experiences with Louisiana had been a couple of Mardi Gras in college that I didn't really remember anyway, so I couldn't really learn too much from that. So when all these things came together, and I got to teach my first class, I really had no idea kind of what to expect. And soon thereafter, I just happened to stumble on a quotation in the newspaper. All right, we're going to say next slide, please. There we go. And in this quotation in the newspaper, it just kind of hit me that in 2004 National Ranking of Higher Education Performance, Louisiana was 49th, a slight improvement over the last place in 2002. And here I am trying to teach college students, not going on. I said, what the heck is going on with this? You know, how could this be? What does this mean? And so from that time on, I set about trying to figure out where this came from, why Louisiana could be in this case. And the eventual result was a book on the history of higher education where I kind of figured everything out. So when I approach the history, I'm kind of simple-minded with a lot of these things. I think the most fascinating history is to take who we are today and work backwards. And these stories of us are both practical and I think exciting. And I think my students find that as well. And so I was searching back with this history of higher education. I kept going back and back and back. And I discovered the roots of it went all the way back to about 16th century Europe. And the one commonality in this journey that I discovered was that the persistence of culture was a theme of all this. And in this persistence of culture, I found that a lot of the cultural attributes in Louisiana of today, back then, were present way back when. And so I started seeing this theme again and again. And in this persistence of culture, there are really 2 parts that came up. The lack of emphasis on education, and also the strong role of governors or their earlier equivalent in society. And this was all well and good, but there was a problem. And that is this persistence of culture, these 2 attributes, were with us arguably before there was even a Louisiana, much less Louisiana higher education. So it's hard to write a book like that when you're trying to figure these things out. And so I thought a little bit more, but then I finally realized that I wasn't writing a history of higher education. I was writing a history of the Louisiana people, just using the lens of higher education, and things worked. And so I was able to trace these attributes all the way through to kind of find what was going on. All right, so in my simple-minded approach, the next step was to ask the most basic question: what part of higher education meant the most to the people of Louisiana today as we're sitting there? And so what do you think the answer was? agriculture, and what was another one? Football. All right? So agriculture could be, but yeah, I found, unfortunately, it kind of hurt my heart to say it, but I thought football was far and away the most important part of higher education. Any newspaper, TV show, all that kind of stuff was football. And football has been a very important part of higher education for quite some time. And so way back to the late 1800s for sure. And so I'm going to give you this quotation, which I thought was great, and I'm going to ask you when it was said, especially given with all the stuff about LSU and everything. Football had passed from the realm of pure sport, where young college men played a game on Saturday afternoons, to a potent factor in the life and reputation of the university. However much many faculty members deplored the fact that the university was being forced to supply large-scale entertainment for masses of people wholly uninterested in higher education, the fact still remained that the university, having once waded into the stream of intercollegiate football competition, found no escape from the ever-increasing current of the waters. Any idea when that was written? 1915, about Tulane football. And so, football has been probably the most important, I would argue, in the state, all the way through. Unfortunately, that fits one of the commonalities about the lack of emphasis on education. And in fact, Tulane has been a football power for a long time. The first Tulane football game was played on November 18th, 1893. And actually, I'm very proud to announce that our own Chancellor, Dr. Tommy Warner, played in that game. And so, I think he's in, oh no, wait a second, I'm sorry. I must have the dates a little bit wrong. That might have been too long. But actually, Dr. Warner was a football star in the 1950s in Tulane, and he ran the first punt, in the first night game, he ran a punt back for a touchdown. And at that time, Tulane was still a major college power, not a little unlike today or whatever. So that was a very good thing. And by the way, Tulane is one of the most important institutions of higher education, arguably the most important private institution of higher education in the state today. But interestingly, it came very, very close to being a VOTEC institute, a vocational college. In fact, early on in 1881, simply by a vote of 9-7 of this board that was deciding, it became an academic college. Just those two votes made the difference. And Paul Tulane, who gave the money for it, was really irritated with this because he thought he was a businessman. He wanted to give back and train the businessmen coming up in New Orleans. And he said, in fact, he was so upset, he almost vetoed it. It was his money, of course, but he didn't. And his objection was that this academic education was merely ornamental or superficial. It wasn't real education, that kind of thing. But so Tulane, of course, we know, became an academic college, and it's one of the best in the region today. Also, very, very close, in 1906, Tulane barely lost a vote in the legislature where they wanted to become a public institution, but because LSU had a little bit more power, prevented that, and it's only by that chance that Tulane is a private institution today. So that's interesting. But back to the football story. My favorite football stories have to do with the Southwestern Louisiana Institute, which is now the University of Louisiana in Lafayette, and a couple of early brushes with fame in football. A guy named Christian Keener Cagle, who played at SLI, and he later is going to go on to West Point and win the Heisman Trophy in 1929. But to show you a little bit about a different time, at that time, West Point had a rule that cadets may not ride on bicycles, chew tobacco, nor have a horse, dog, wife, or mustache. And unfortunately, Cagle married his SLI college sweetheart about a month before graduation and was kicked out of school because of that. And so it's a little bit different with Heisman Trophy winners today, than way back when. But the next football story having to do with the Southwestern Louisiana Institute is a little more serious. And especially nowadays. So in the 1930s, SNLI had a few losing seasons, and so it was time to hire a new football coach. It came down to two candidates, both former University of Alabama players, and it turns out that whoever was the equivalent athletic director chose a guy named Johnny Kane, and he did a decent job as his line. But anybody want to guess the candidate they didn't? That's right. Everybody heard of him? All right, so imagine what might have happened if UL Lafayette would have chosen Bear Bryant. And in the act of full disclosure, I know this is a sensitive topic, I must say, in my younger days, I did take a few classes at the University of Alabama, but I never graduated, so it's okay. And I would never, ever rub in the fact that Alabama has beaten LSU lately and all that kind of stuff. I would never do that. So, all right. So regarding, even with football, the first commonality, the lack of emphasis on education, kind of football fits in there. However, the other commonality of the strong governors, it does as well. And with all these things, and I'm going to say this again and again throughout this talk, and that is that Huey Long is going to play a very important role. All right? So this is even the cover of the book, and with my simple approach to things, and I tell my students this, the ideas matter much, and so you put the biggest, most basic idea on the cover of the book about what that book's about, and as odd as it is, to have a book called The History of Higher Education with Huey Long on the front of it, it's my argument that Huey Long did more to shape higher education in Louisiana than any other individual or institution. Right. And it has to do a lot with these strong governors. But just regarding football, with Huey Long, Huey Long got actively involved with LSU football. He is going to call the plays in the game. He very involved in the band. He offered state jobs to players who scored touchdowns. One time, LSU lost by a point, so he introduced a bill to the legislature to ban the point after touchdown. The biggest star at the time was Abe Michael, and he was just a college student. He did very, very well. Long was appreciative. So Long rewarded him by appointing him to a senatorial vacancy, despite the fact he was under 21, a native of Mississippi, and did not live in the parish where the senatorial vacancy was supposed to come from. All right, so Long was very involved in all that, and that's one of the best parts of the history, I think, are the stories about Long getting involved personally with all these things. And it wasn't just stories from Louisiana. These were reported. It was reported widely in the New York Times about Huey Long, the governor of Louisiana, deciding about the college coach for the LSU football team. But anyway, so the football was very important, but lots of people had written books on football, so I figured I should go a little bit deeper than that. And at the other, what I thought were less popular but more important aspects of higher education. So we got back to the whole thing of the persistence of culture, and that's where everything came from. So I went all the way back to the beginning of Louisiana, and Louisiana was actually, her cultural upbringing was schizophrenic, the child of three parents, France, Spain, and America. Really none of them really cared for her too much. All right, and so, but all these mixings of different aspects of these very different cultures is going to cause eventually higher education in Louisiana. All right, and so the one of these three cultures that are all going to eventually come together, that are all very different, one of the very, very few aspects that was common was a lack of emphasis on education itself and higher education among the three. The French and the Spanish side of things both thought that education wasn't necessarily needed for the masses. The very elites could have education, but the common person, what reason would they have for education? Because they'd be doing the same thing that their parents did over and over again. And in fact, both France and Spain thought that Louisiana was one of the most uncivilized of their colonies. And so they gave institutions of higher education to other colonies of theirs, but they kept it from Louisiana because they thought Louisiana would especially not benefit from it, given their nature. All right, and in the American parent of Louisiana, it's going to turn out that the American South, which of course Louisiana is going to be a part of, is much different than the Northern America in education. In the North, coming from the 13 colonies of Britain, in the North part, the Puritans especially greatly valued education, not for its own sake, but just to be literate, to be able to read the Bible, meant you can get to heaven, and thus reading was important in the North. Likewise, the agricultural setup, just what it tended to, not because it was planned, meant there were lots of small farms kind of centered around villages, and so there was a chance that you could have like a schoolhouse in a village and enough population around where people could go to school. So in the North, it just kind of grew up culturally to appreciating education, and if you fast forward till today, it's in the North where all of the education and higher education statistics are much, much better than in Louisiana. The South, the American South, was very different. And it tended more towards plantation-style agriculture, generally not too many villages and cities and those kind of things. So even if there was a need for education, there was such vast distances, it'd be very hard to get it. And of course, the Southern elite, which is hire tutors for their children or send them off to Europe. Likewise, the immigrants who came over and settled from England, who came over and settled the South, they didn't care as much about education anyway. All right, so all these things got together. So when Louisiana kind of became part of the American South, this lack of emphasis in education is gonna combine with the French and Spanish lack of emphasis for education. The second overall part of that then is going to be about the strong governors, these very strong executives. And this is kind of what goes all the way back. In French and Spanish Louisiana, there's a very strong tradition of very strong governors, very strong executives. And this comes from the Europe that they were both part of. In both cases, probably France is the more famous of the example. In France, like at the turn of the 18th century, we'll say there was a strong king system of government. If you've heard of Louis XIV, which most everybody has, Louis XIV may be one of the strongest kings of all. And of course, it's for him that Louisiana is named, as well as the family name is Bourbon, so Bourbon Street comes from that. And most importantly, the fleur-de-lis was the royal symbol. You can kind of see some on his coat if it's big enough, all right? And so I tell my students always the most amazing thing that an obscure historical symbol from 1600s Europe could come down, and I know a lot of people who have that fleur-de-lis tattoo on themselves, and that's crazy for a historical symbol. The reason is because it meant a lot to Louisiana, and normally I say that it's very odd that a very violent, rough sport football team like the New Orleans Saints would have a flower for a symbol, but maybe this season it's more appropriate. I don't know, but anyway. So in the strong king system of Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King, he was above everybody else. Everybody else was below him. He made the decisions, and everybody else had to live with it. And so the French colonial part of Louisiana is going to have a governor who has the same type of relationship. And in fact, the corruption of Louisiana that we're known for comes from this system, because under Louis XIV, he himself granted all things of value, like any type of corporation or to go explore something. And so the only way you could make any money at this time was to get up next to the king somehow to get his favor, so that his inner circle, who had access to him every day, could get these favors, and thus people would go to the inner circle and kind of convince them to get the favor. And that's kind of where corruption comes from with these strong governors. All right, so Louis XIV's France, strong governor system, this is going to come down. Spain was similar, so Louisiana grows up until 1803 when it becomes American with this system. The opposite of that is the American system from England, or wheat king system. The kings of England would have loved them in that strong. Step by step, they were forced to give power to bodies that checked their power, and then slowly that became what we call democracy, and more people got to participate. So the America that Louisiana is going to come into was known for a lot more democracy, a participatory democratic system, a common law system, all these things that we know about. But when Louisiana was joined to that, there was almost a civil war because French, Spanish, Louisiana didn't like any of that. All right, so but all that came together, and the result then, when Louisiana becomes parts of America, right from that point, the governors are going to have a lot more power than in any other state. And the people are going to appreciate that system somehow, or at least live with it. All right, so that's that long ago stuff that we had to get through. And so, but that set the culture. And so let's fast forward then into what I call the formative period of higher education. All right, which is going to be 1928 to 1972. And that's when we get back to our friend Huey Long. So keep with this base in mind, the higher education is going to get into the modern age. Up until 1917, or about World War I, less than 5% of Americans even went to higher education. Very, very small number, and it was mostly to be a lawyer or to be a priest. And you learned Greek and Latin and those kind of things. However, by 1937, that number is going to triple to over 15%. And this is when we first have our first era of higher education. In Louisiana, while this national trend is going on, that's where we have Huey Long. And Huey Long, he's going to first become governor in 1928. That's why this time starts that. He's going to be known as America's dictator, and he's going to take this strong executive centralism, or strong governor model, and he's going to take it to heights not seen before, for good and bad. Because Huey Long's going to be different. He's going to undoubtedly be a dictator, and the New York Times and others commonly refer to him as America's dictator. But for the first time, he's going to use that strong power for the average person. Before 1928, the governors would just deal with the elites mostly. So Huey Long, he's got the power, but he's going to do it for people like us. Thus, coming down through history, probably in this crowd and anybody else, if I asked, was Huey Long a good influence or a bad influence, it'd be about 50-50. So we'll see. And maybe we can talk about that later. But even it depends on how you look at it, if they're good or bad, but I'll mention some of the examples. Also, what's little known about Long, I think, is that he came incredibly close to being president and spreading this model all over. Heading up to the 1936 presidential election, of course, Franklin D. Roosevelt was president. Long had started a third-party campaign that he thought he had a chance to win presidency in 1936 or thereafter, and Roosevelt was scared. Roosevelt and his advisors were scared of Long, and in fact, they started taking on some of Long's signature issues, and that's when Social Security comes along. So I'll argue that Huey Long was responsible for Social Security being enacted, but Huey Long's going to be assassinated in 1935, so we'll never know. All right. But he wanted to take this kind of strong dictatorial style for the average person and spread it across the country, and came very close. I always like these examples too of how strong the governor was at the time, because it's hard to know. Two examples among the many. For Long in 1932, he's going to be elected to the Senate from the U.S. Senate from Louisiana, but he wants to keep control of Louisiana as well. He runs a guy named Oscar Allen, somebody who he can control the 1932 election. And so Oscar Allen received In St. Bernard Parish, the vote count was 3,152 to 0 among 4 candidates, and the number of registered voters was about 2,500. So when you read these stories, nobody's hiding this. Nobody's hiding these dictatorial tendencies. And of course, most famously, I guess, somebody asked Long if he had ever read the state constitution, and he replied publicly, "I am the Constitution of Louisiana." All right, so the strong governor model in this formative period is in place, but at the same time, Long is going to spend a huge amount of money and capital and interest and everything in making LSU one of the premier universities in the country at this time. It's going to grow greatly, and in fact, these accomplishments at LSU were one of the proudest accomplishments by Long, as he stated. Just as got in the good and bad part of it, historian at the time said, education in the state's largest school became an instrument of dictatorship, a unique implement whose utilization has no parallel in American university records. All right, so he did get a lot done, it was good, but it was he used LSU not so much as an higher educational institution, but more of an organ of state government. He controlled all the professors and who was hired professor and used it as a patronage machine, and controlled it directly, like he would hire and fire personally, and lead the band and all that. And then, of course, LSU was known a little bit for corruption at this time. Uniquely, in the 1930s, the Supreme Court had decided that for the federal income tax, which remember had only been around for about 15 years or so, the Supreme Court had decided that illegal income was also subject to federal income tax. And so if you've heard of Al Capone in Chicago, he went to jail for income tax evasion. That's how they got him. But they had not dealt with Louisiana folks before. And when they came down to prosecute some Louisiana politicians, including with LSU, they discovered that the Louisiana politicians had declared their legal income on their taxes. So they couldn't get them that way. But of course, they found another way, and several of the people involved with LSU at this time went on to federal prison and some other stuff. All right, so, but that being said, LSU is catapulted to the modern age and becomes a very, very important institution in Louisiana. Another interesting thing at this time, and this is more for the higher education folks, but maybe most of you know that probably the most important institution in a college these days is called SACS, the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools. They are the accrediting body, and generally in today's world, if SACS does not accredit a college, they cease to exist. And I just know in Nunez right now is in the final part of a SACS report that we're preparing. So there was an instance where a professor back in this time was fired because of politics. If you didn't choose if you didn't choose the right governor, then even the professors were fired. And so he reported this firing to SACS, because SACS very much frowns on political involvement. And so SACS had been investigating. This was at Louisiana Normal Institute, which is a teacher's college, which is now Northwestern State University. SACS had been investigating them for a while under the thought that Huey Long might be running the school, which he probably was. And so this threat, this professor kind of got all high and mighty and said, to the president of the college, I reported you to SACS, and thus you're going to be in trouble. And so he met at a meeting, and the president, the president said, we don't care what the Southern Association says. You should know that the school people of Louisiana do not run the schools. They're run by the politicians, and they don't know anything about the Southern Association, and they don't give a damn about it. And if they knew we were members, they would make us get out. All right, so, and of course the school did lose its SACS accreditation, but eventually it got restored in about 5-10 years later. So it worked out all right. So in Louisiana, the kind of strong governor model is in place, Meanwhile, in Louisiana and elsewhere in these 30s and 40s, though, the GI Bill after World War II, or the Services Readjustment Act of 1944, which you might have heard of, also called the GI Bill of Rights, this is going to come in and greatly change later higher education once again. All these returning service members after World War II, there was actually Franklin Roosevelt had a worry about it would cause another depression. What would they do for jobs? So he tried to find a way to give them something to do for a couple of years, hoping the economy would get better by then. And it was almost an inconsequential thing that was almost little noticed. But looking back as historians, this might be one of the top government programs of the 20th century, because it really is going to democratize higher education. And by 1956, about a little over 10 years later, 2.2 million of these service members had gone to a college or university, and another 6.6 million had had some higher level of training. So this is really going to be, for the first time, bring higher education to the masses, and not coincidentally, it's going to help fuel a huge economic boom in the 50s and 60s and beyond, and we're going to have trained managers and technicians to be able to do that. All right, so 30s and 40s, kind of keep going on in Louisiana, but higher education is going to change and grow much bigger, in part because of the GI Bill. As part of this formative period, then moving on to the 1950s and seeing the highlights, the most important part of the 1950s, I think, is also representative of kind of the third major facet of Louisiana higher education, along with LSU's importance and Tulane's importance. In Louisiana, we developed a dual system of higher education, a segregated system of higher education. And in today's world, it's kind of had a curious result. But going back, the development of UNO, which was called LSU at the time, University of New Orleans, and Southern University of New Orleans, or SUNO, kind of represent this system where all throughout the state, we have two institutions of higher education, at first segregated, right next to each other. All right, it's kind of a unique Louisiana approach. And in 1956, UNO was established by Earl Long. Once again, the governor's having a prime effect. But when you read the history of higher education in a lot of other states, it's usually a college president or a community benefactor or something like that. But in Louisiana, it's almost always governors. Earl Long wanted to establish a University of New Orleans, which did not have one. And of course, the LSU folks fought that for a very long time. He finally got it done, and almost accidentally, UNO, established by Earl Long, is going to be one of the best examples of the early civil rights movement, because UNO is going to be the first public state-supported university of higher education in the Deep South, because it is going to be integrated. What happened was Earl Long wanted a university for whites. You couldn't do that at this time because of the early civil rights movement, so he also established SUNO, thinking that would be the segregated college. However, quite a few people, quite a few African Americans registered at UNO, and Earl Long didn't fight it. And so thus, accidentally, UNO satisfied that segregated institute. But this kind of raised the two issues, a little bit fascinating, that's going to be part of higher education since then. And that was Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, which you might have heard of, had integrated schools. Technically it was K-12 schools, but it really applied generally. So SUNO was a historically black segregated university, created, the only one created after the Brown v. Board in 1954. So even then there was a big question about what is the role of historically black college in an integrated society. And SUNO has been struggling with that ever since. Other one is this dual system of higher education, where you put two major colleges right next to each other. Of course, there's UNO and SUNO. There's LSU and Southern in Baton Rouge. There's Grambling, Louisiana Tech. there are a whole host of others as well, and even some community colleges, that they're just within miles. So fast forwarding until today, in a time of budget cuts and efficiencies of higher education, to have these two major colleges right next to each other is kind of wasteful. However, it's virtually impossible to close, nationally, it's virtually impossible to close a public college or university. And so it's just kind of a legacy we have to live with. I'm sure you've probably seen in the last year or two with SUNO, and possibly about merging with UNO, and it did not work. Actually, this merger talk about SUNO has been brought up at least 3 times over the past decades, and each time it didn't work either. All right, so, but anyway, I always was fascinated. One that Earl Long kind of accidentally was a civil rights leader, because he definitely didn't necessarily want the integration, but also leaves a legacy from the 1950s. All right, so moving on to the 1960s then. And this is really where we have the way higher education is organized in today's world. All right, and that is with a governor, John McKeithen, who was governor from 1964 to 1972. McKeithen was actually a protege of Earl Long, and come to find out, he was McKeithen's mother was Earl Long's girlfriend, right? So I think that's how he got to his position. And he would say that when he was, I guess he was in the Senator House in Louisiana first, McKeithen was, he would say that he and Long would get together, or he and Earl Long would get together and make up the state's budget, the two of them, in 30 minutes. That's how they worked it. All right, so, which I was fascinating. Probably for McKeithen, probably his most famous thing that he did was the Superdome was built under his watch. And as the power of governor example is still in Louisiana at this time, in 1964, the governor of Louisiana appointed more people to office than any other state governor in the nation except for New York. And of course, at the time, Louisiana did not have nearly as much population as a lot of those. And McKeithen, though, for a historian of higher education, is very curious, because he was absolutely crucially influential, but it was never mentioned once. I don't think he ever realized that he was doing any of it. Even he never mentioned his accomplishments in higher education. Nobody mentioned about him, and yet they were absolutely key. And kind of along the nationally what's going on at this time is going to be the baby boom generation, with this huge demographic boom from 1946 to 64. So by the 60s, an incredible number of people are going to be coming to college because of this boom. So in the decade covering the 1960s in Nichols State, the enrollment increased 573%. And that's common throughout Louisiana and throughout the nation. So looking back at the late 1940s, higher education got kind of democratized, a little boost, but it's going to be this baby boom 60s, 70s that are going to bring us eventually to the 60% college attendance level that we have today, at least some college. All right. Also, before I get to what McKeithen did, the alternate version, which is going to come up later, in the 1960s in California, Clark Kerr was doing something called the California model. The California model, which is going to revolutionize higher education pretty much elsewhere in the country. And that was, he set up a 3-tiered system. You had your very select universities at the very top, and they are the ones that pretty much offer the PhDs. You had a series of regional universities, second tier, and then third, you have a very wide network of open access community college. This allowed the lower level classes and developmental classes and other things like that to be taught at community college, which was very cheap and effective. And thus, people could move up through the ranks if they showed an ability in working and all that. So it's going to find for most of the nation, this system, this California model, is going to be the best, most cost-effective way to organize higher education, and we in Louisiana are going to come to that around the year, almost to the year 2000. But before then, back in the 1960s with McKeithen, he's going to come up with what he calls the all-in-one model. And at the time, it essentially is giving all things to every university. So at every university, teaches people from below college level, people are preparing for college level, all the way up to the PhDs. All right, so, and to increase the role as these universities are growing everywhere in the state. So in 1970 alone, in Louisiana, 6 colleges were granted the ability to offer PhDs. And in 1967, 6 had university status, kind of overnight. So in other words, a lot of these colleges that maybe had not taught at the very high levels, kind of the directional colleges you might have heard of across the state, they were kind of upgraded all at once while keeping the same lower level functions. So across Louisiana, the universities did everything. Also, very importantly, there were almost no academic two-year colleges in Louisiana. All those functions were handled with the universities themselves. All right, so going forward with that, and also I might have said, one of the good parts of this California model, the 3-tiered California model, is it really keeps the legislature, the state legislature, out of the process. But of course in Louisiana, we kind of picked a different way. All right, so moving on to the 1970s then, and this is what I call the contemporary period of higher education, and that is going to start with mainly with Edwin Edwards, who's going to be governor in 4 terms from 1972 to 1976. There'll be a few spaces in between. Edwin Edwards also had a lot of influence on higher education, but he didn't really know about it. He didn't really realize that he did. And the motivating factor during Edwards' term is going to be, and I think a right one, that this lack of emphasis in higher education, because really at the time in Louisiana, you did not, because of the nature of the jobs, you did not need a higher education to have a very good job that would take care of your family and all that, a very good middle class job. At the time, the oil boom was going on, and so there were plenty of those kind of jobs that didn't require college education, and arguably it just wasn't needed. Louisiana had kind of traditionally did not have a lot of higher education related jobs. In fact, Louisiana was one of the last states in 1949 to even require a 12th year of regular school, a 4th and 12th grade. Before 1949, the lower schools or whatever ended in 11th grade, and people just went out and got work. And so, and only 13% of students entering first grade got a college degree in Louisiana at this time. So with Edwards, with his philosophy, arguably, he put a lot of his emphasis and he actually established a lot, especially with the VOTEC system, which was away from higher education and more preparing people for the workforce. So throughout the 1970s, that worked pretty well. Also in 1972, Edwards, with the Constitutional Convention, is going to create our modern Board of Regents and kind of get forward with the master plans we have today. Worked well until the 1980s, and that's when we had the oil bust. The oil bust of the 1980s hit Louisiana very hard. A lot of these jobs for high school graduates, give or take, that were available were no longer available. At the same time, nationally, there became a market change in the nature of jobs due to computerization and also the export of jobs and lower skill jobs overseas. It became almost needed for a middle class type and above salary to have a college degree. Those kind of jobs that you can make a very, very good wage in manufacturing or the oil field or those kind of things with less than a college degree went away in large numbers. And so in the 1980s, there became a shift in Louisiana as well, back towards a more academic-related higher education, and in order to try to get people in Louisiana up to these jobs. But of course, it became difficult. And this shift is going to happen primarily in 1996 and 2004, when Mike Foster becomes governor, and he is going to follow national trends, and he is going to try to shift Louisiana back to this California model approach. The first thing, well, before I do that, and this is always a very dangerous thing in Louisiana, to talk bad about any governors, and I have to say I did this before I knew what I was doing, but the power of the governor example with Mike Foster, when he was governor, he nominated an individual to lead the University of Louisiana system. On the same day, this individual put in his application, and just a day before the job search ended, this individual got the job. And a week earlier, the requirement for a PhD had been mysteriously dropped. And it was openly talked about by Foster that people say, well, it seemed like the fix was in. He said, yeah, it was. And this individual was Bobby Jindal, who of course became governor a little bit later. So I hope he doesn't read a copy of my book, because I don't want to, that's dangerous in Louisiana sometimes, maybe not. But anyway, so Mike Foster is going to bring Louisiana to its current age of higher education by going back to this California model approach. He's going to, first off, the first step that he needed to do was create what's called the LCTCS, or the Louisiana Community and Technical College System, of which Nunez is a part. That's going to be in 1999. So it established this lower tier of community colleges. The next step then was to raise entrance requirements at the four-year universities with the intent of moving the first 2 years of classes and all developmental classes down to the lower cost community college, and then having the upper classes taught at the four-year colleges. And so all of this was supposed to take effect by 2005, right after he ended his tenure. And I think it has taken effect this year, give or take, for about the first time, but it is kind of changing the nature of higher education in Louisiana, shifting more away from this all-in-one model to this three-tiered system, kind of in fits and starts. All right, so that's a quick overview of higher education in Louisiana. I think that's probably enough of it. So does anybody have any? Okay.